Hi, I'm Mike Winkler, and I'm the Principal Managing Broker for Coldwell Banker Bain in Issaquah, Washington.
And I'm E.J. Bowles. I'm the Principal Managing Broker for Coldwell Banker Bain on Mercer Island, Washington.
EJ, this is the second of our series on earnest money. So,
True, we talked about the philosophy of earnest money. Last time we're going to talk a little bit about the processes that we go through with earnest money in this blog post. One of the things we mentioned last time was that earnest money is rarely more than 5% of the purchase price. And the reason for that is a very famous court case that was heard in the 90s called the Lynn case, where the Washington Court of Appeals held that 5% of the purchase price was the amount of liquidated damages that a seller could get from a buyer who had defaulted. And remember, default is when the buyer decides to not close without a legal excuse. And we've had many blog posts where we've talked about all the different ways that provide legal excuses in terms of due diligence for buyers to not close. But a default is not closing without any of those legal ways out of the contract.
and of course, we're not offering legal advice here. We're simply talking about the processes that we go through on a regular basis as real estate brokers.
That's correct, Mike.
So in our last post, EJ, you mentioned that we would discuss the DOL and the audit process. And
What's the DOL, Mike?
well, the DOL is the Department of Licensing, and in Washington, it's a pretty all-encompassing agency that governs licensing for virtually every type of business that you can imagine, and so including real estate. And so the DOL, as part of their duties, goes forth on a regular basis and audits real estate firms and their branches. And they do so under the guise that they are helping us to become better at our jobs and protecting the consumer. And I really believe that, because I have found them to be very supportive and helpful. But like my colleagues, what I've found that is most concerning to them is earnest money. And what they're looking for primarily is a chain of custody from the buyer to the agent, from the agent to the firm, and from the firm to the either the trust account for the firm or to the third party that's going to hold escrow or hold the earnest money, typically escrow, if it's not the trust account for the firm. And so it's really important that along those lines there are the proper documentation to support that chain of custody. So that would include typically a Northwest MLS Form 89 for the receipt from the client to the broker, and then a proof of deposit for the trust account or for the escrow.
Right, and earnest money that would be held by a firm, a real estate firm, is held in a trust account, what's called a trust account. And a trust account is a special account where client funds are held, and the Department of Licensing has a number of rules that govern how trust accounts are used and regulated in the state of Washington, including a number of record-keeping rules that we won't get into. But one of the rules, the main rules that we have regarding trust accounts, is that real estate firms cannot commingle their funds with the client funds. So the funds in that trust account are held in trust specifically for clients and can only come out of that trust account per the contract terms, by agreements of the parties, the buyer and the seller, and of course at the closing of the contract it can come out also as part of the real estate commission.
We've talked about the default by the buyer, which default again is when the buyer fails to close without legal reason. And in the purchase and sale contract, during the original negotiation, the buyer and the seller negotiate what will be the remedy should the buyer default. And generally, in fact, I can honestly say I've never seen it be otherwise in the contracts that I've reviewed, but that doesn't mean that there's not that rare occasion. But generally, it is the earnest money that is provided to the seller for a buyer default.
Right. And that's also the limit of the buyer's liability too. That's another important thing to remember.
Correct. And so what's interesting though about this whole issue with regards to the DOL and audits and why they do it is unless the earnest money is actually deposited, then if that doesn't occur, then what is the remedy for the seller? You know,
Exactly.
I mean, do they want to spend a whole lot of money for suing the buyer? The fact is that earnest money really is the compensation for a seller who has taken their home off the market under the contract for that period of time if the buyer defaults.
That's correct.
And so the audit serves a valuable purpose and tool because if the earnest money is never deposited, then it puts sellers in awkward positions. And I would argue as part of this that and I know the DOL would support me on this, I feel pretty comfortable, that although the earnest money is generally handled by the selling firm and or the third party who holds it if it's escrow, it's the responsibility of both the selling firm and the listing firm to have copies of those receipts. Interestingly, I recently had a discussion with a listing agent who said, well, why do I have to have that? And then even more interestingly, a week later, there was a default in a contract, and the earnest money should go to the seller, only no earnest money was ever deposited. And in that particular case, there was no deposit on record or no receipts even provided to show that the earnest money was collected and deposited. So in that particular case, it demonstrates clearly why it's the responsibility of both parties to maintain those records and have those receipts, and to do so not because the DOL audits it, but because you're serving your client. There's no client protection unless those things occur.
I agree. The other thing, the last part of this is that what happens if, we talked about buyer default, what happens if there's a dispute between the buyer and the seller over the earnest money? That normally happens when the seller says that the buyer's defaulted and the buyer disagrees, no I haven't, for whatever reason. In that case, whoever's holding the earnest money, after attempting to mediate for a short period of time between the buyer and the seller, if that mediation is unsuccessful, they're going to send that earnest money to the Superior Court in the county where they're located. Superior Court will send a summons to the buyer and the seller to show up in court at a later date to argue over that earnest money. And that can take several months. So it doesn't happen a lot, but there is an ultimate, if there's ultimately no agreement on how to disperse earnest money, it does end up in the courts.
Well, and also by contract, because implied or not implied in the agreement, in the boilerplate, is the fact that if it does go to interplead, there's going to be a deduction of $500 for the cost of the interpleading, but that's just one of the costs, because more often than not, the buyer and the seller will have attorneys represent them. So the bottom line is negotiating the earnest money is probably the best solution.
Oh, absolutely. You don't want to go to Superior Court without an attorney, so that would be an extra cost for sure. I'm E.J. Bowles.
I'm Mike Winkler. Till next time.